opposition. Questions without notice. Are there any questions?
There are, Mr. Speaker.
I give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, your website currently states, and I quote, "A Labor government will cut power bills for families and businesses by $275 a year." Is this still your policy?
I give the call to the Prime Minister. Order.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I could just refer to my answer of yesterday, but that would, but that wouldn't be as much fun as going through what our policy is, because our policy is very clear. Our Powering Australia plan is indeed up on the website, and something that might be unfamiliar to those opposite is the concept of putting out an energy policy that you're going to actually implement. Because those opposite had 22 energy policies and didn't implement any of them. The other thing that might be confusing for those opposite is the concept of putting out a policy that's fully costed and that has detailed economic analysis, in this case by Reputex, Australia's leading energy economists. And what Australia's leading energy economists said is that if you embrace the changes that we're advancing, including fixing transmission through our Rewiring the Nation plan, making sure that we bring the electricity grid into the 21st century, if you have a policy that upgrades—
Order.
Well, if you're not interested—
The Prime Minister is being relevant, specifically about the policy that he was asked about. I will give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, it is on relevance, and I refer you to the many statements of former Speaker Smith in relation to questions, the construction of questions. The question is very clear. On the Prime Minister's website it states, and I quote, "A Labor government will cut power bills for families and businesses by $275
Order.
a year."
Resume your seat. The Prime Minister is answering the question. He is referring to the policy. Resume your seat. Order. The Prime Minister is being relevant, entirely relevant, and I give him the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Those opposite.
Order. Order. The Leader of the Opposition has asked his question in silence. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence. Order. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Those opposite are confused by the idea that you could put out a comprehensive policy plan to deal with energy in this country and that you would have proper modelling that was put out last December, wasn't questioned in January, not in February, not in March, not in April, not in May. But, of course, what was not known at that time— What was not known—
Members on
was
my
that those opposite had actually sat on and changed the rules to hide from the Australian people the increase in energy costs that occurred on July 1. They went, as I outlined yesterday, in a series of moves to deliberately stop the Australian people knowing before May 21 that they had baked in an increase. That is their responsibility.
The Prime Minister's time
we'll be reducing energy prices.
And I give the order. The House will hear questions in silence. And I give the call to the member for Tangney.
My question is to the Minister for Skill and Training. After a decade of inaction, we are experiencing a skill shortage crisis in Australia. How will the Albanese Labor government address acute skills shortages?
give the call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for asking a very important question, and congratulations to you for your election to this place, the member for Tangney. A remarkable result in Western Australia. Very well done, and you'll make a fine contribution to this place. Well, can I say, Mr Speaker, wherever you look across the labour market, there are skill shortages, whether that be in the care sector, teaching, engineering, advanced manufacturing, tourism, hospitality, so many areas, even the traditional trades like bricklayers, personal care services like hairdressers. Wherever we look across the economy and labour market, there are skill shortages, and the fact is, it's true to say that the pandemic had something to contribute to that fact, no doubt about that. But so too did the failure of the previous government in investing in areas of emerging demand. So too did the previous government fail to invest in skills in areas the vacancies that exist now and areas of emerging demand. For that reason, this government has hit the ground running. We are starting by creating Jobs and Skills Australia, bringing together employers and unions and state and territory governments and others to work on this challenge together. It's the reason why we're convening a Jobs and Skills Summit within a month, so that we can work with stakeholders, employers and others about delivering on training that is needed in this country. It's one of the reasons why my colleagues are unclogging the visa applications that are, of course, clogged up and have not been able to fill the vacancies that our employers are crying out for. So, Mr Speaker, there is a lot for us to do. It's also why we're announcing providing 465,000 fee-free TAFE places, an additional 45,000 TAFE places, particularly for those industries suffering acute shortages. It's also why we're making sure that we have 10,000 apprentices in the energy sector, an energy sector in transition. We will need those apprentices with new skills to deliver the change and to respond to the changes that are occurring. Mr Speaker, for Labor, providing opportunities to improve one's lot through training and education is core business, and it always will be. It always will be. As the Prime Minister said, and we've said often here, we don't want to leave anyone behind and we don't want to hold anyone back. Well, investing in skills and training provides opportunities for people to enter the labour market, but also to change the skills where necessary, improve upon their skills and knowledge so they can work in areas of in demand. And it's also true to say, Speaker, that a more productive workforce, a smarter workforce, means cheaper goods and services. So investing in skills in this area is not only good for workers, it's not only good for employers, it's good for everyone who are tackling and struggling with cost of living pressures.
Order. I'll give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, in April, when you were caught not knowing the cash rate, you said, "I made a mistake. I'm human. When I make a mistake, I'll fess up to it, and I'll set about correcting that mistake. I won't blame someone else. I'll accept responsibility. That's what leaders do." End quote. Prime Minister, given you've dumped your promise to cut power bills by $275, will you fess up and correct your mistake?
Give the call. Order. The Prime Minister will be heard. Members on my right. Members on my right. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for her question. I don't seek to have a point of order on irony to rule it out, given the record of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, who made a bit of a mistake that led to her resignation from the front bench of the Liberal Party.
Order. Order.
But now she's back.
Order.
Now
Members on my left.
Now she's back.
Order. The Prime Minister's being... Order. The Manager of Opposition Business will be heard in silence. I call... Order. Order. I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Reflection on a member, Mr Speaker. That was quite inappropriate. The Prime Minister should answer the specific question, does he stand by his promise on $275 reduction or
I'm
not?
listening. Thank you. Resume your seat. I'm listening to the Prime Minister carefully, and I'll ask him to return to the question.
Yeah. The fact is that those opposite knew that power prices were going up, but they kept Australians in the dark. That's what they did. They knew about the price increase in March. they hid the increase in the default retail price for electricity, which for a small business in New South Wales increased by up to 19.7% in New South Wales, just in New South Wales alone. What our policy is aimed at, and we stand by completely, the modelling that we put out by Reputex, which showed that when you invest in renewables, because now this isn't a difficult concept, okay? Renewables are cheaper. If you have cheaper energy inputs, you get cheaper prices. And what Reputex model,
The Leader of the Nationals.
what Reputex
The
model,
Leader of the Nationals.
what Reputex modelled was the impact of Labor's plan with rewiring the nation, our plan
Manager of Opposition
on
Business.
other elements of the grid, including using the safeguards mechanism that was established by the Abbott government, when they were in government.
The Prime Minister will just take a break. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will state the point of order, and I'm listening carefully to her point of order.
We know the Prime Minister has a bad memory, but on relevance, Mr.
Resume your
Speaker,
seat. No, the Leader of the House, resume your seat. I want to be very clear. I'm giving the courtesy to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition because of her title, and she's earned that title. If I'm asking you to state a point of order, I ask you to state it, not give a statement. The Prime Minister will continue.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. So it's a pretty simple principle here, and everyone understands that and no amount of bluster from those opposite will replace their failure over a decade of inaction. Over a decade of inaction. And the truth is that if you have a plan for more renewables in the system, because they are cheaper, you will have cheaper energy prices. And that's what Reputex modelled. But those opposite couldn't grasp that. That's why they produced 22 different policies, 22 shots at lowering prices, and didn't nail any of them. And the worst of all the ministers was the member for Hume, who failed completely, and then, during an election campaign, went to the Governor-General to change the rules in order to hide the fact that prices would be going up on July 1.
Time has concluded. I give the call to the member for Chisholm.
My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to address rising energy costs caused by a decade of climate and energy policy failure?
I give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Chisholm for a question and congratulate her on a win, and we look forward to a long and substantial contribution in this House. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the answer to dealing with rising power prices is the same as the answer to reduce emissions. That is more renewable energy, because we know on this side of the House that clean energy is cheap energy. We know the sun doesn't send a bill and the wind doesn't send an invoice, something that the honourable members opposite haven't worked out. Today, normally, Mr. Speaker, normally I'd say the opposition doesn't have any ideas, but to be fair, we always try to be fair on this side. They've got one today. Their answer to rising energy prices is to put more of the most expensive form of energy, nuclear, into the system. That's their answer. That's the Leader of the Opposition's big announcement today, that he supports the most expensive form of energy available, nuclear energy. Well done. Well done. Now, Mr. Speaker, another part of our agenda, of course, is the climate bill before the House. This is the bill which locks in our emissions reductions target, makes them the law of the land, and importantly sends the signal to the investors around the world that the 22 failed energy policy era is over. The country has one energy policy, and it is the policy in the law of the land. And there's been a very wide range of support to legislate We've got the Business Council of Australia calling for the legislation to pass, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Superannuation Investors. Mr. Speaker, a range of groups from Greenpeace to Rio Tinto, all calling for the legislation to pass. A very broad coalition calling for the legislation to pass. There's a very narrow coalition opposing it, though, and that's the coalition opposite, Mr. Speaker. After 9 years of denial and delay, they want to continue. They want to keep those 9 years going longer. It just goes to show you, Mr. Speaker, you can change the face at the front of the shop, but they're still selling the same old dud product. This is the modern Liberal Party. What you see is what you get. They haven't changed. You can change from the member for Cook to the member for Dixon. Maybe you could change again, but the product hasn't changed. They still don't accept the science of climate change. They still believe in denial and delay.
His seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Order. I would like to hear the point of order in silence.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister was asked about what the Albanese Labor government is doing to address power prices, and instead we've heard this unstructured spray against the record
the Minister
of this side of the House.
The Manager of Opposition Business room is seat. I will hear from the Leader of the House on the point of order.
Yeah, thanks. If I, Mr. Speaker, to the point of order, may complete the sentence that the Manager of Opposition Business cut short. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to address rising energy costs caused by a decade of climate and energy policy failure? I think that makes it relevant.
Further to the point of order, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr. Speaker, the question is really one for you. Is it the case that simply by putting in...
Resume your seat. I understand your point. Resume your seat. The question, it is a question for me, thank you for that. The question was, what is the government doing to address rising power costs given a decade of failure? I want to be clear on this. If that is the phrase of the question, then it is entirely relevant for a minister to refer to previous decisions, what has led to this decision. I'm calling him in order and I give him the call now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is this is the modern Liberal Party. Out of touch with the challenges of today, the biggest challenge facing our world is climate change. The biggest economic opportunity facing our nation is climate change. And these guys didn't get it for 9 years and they still don't get it. You can change the face at the front of the shop. They're still selling the same old dud product.
Order. The member for Goldstone will be heard in silence. I give the call to the member for Goldstone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport. Why does the government's new aged care legislation grant legal immunity from liability for engaging in restrictive practices? And will the minister reconsider this and offer an indemnity rather than immunity to aged care providers, as proposed by the Australian Lawyers Alliance and other experts? There are many fine aged care facilities, including several within Goldstein. However, per the Royal Commission, there are far too many instances of mistreatment of residents.
I give the call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
Well, I thank the member for Goldstein for her question, and may I congratulate her on her election victory and welcome her to this place. She's very welcome indeed, and congratulate her on her first speech, which we heard earlier. Can I also acknowledge the way that you've answered this question, that it's in good faith, and I welcome the opportunity to assuage some of the concerns. I know that this issue has been ventilated last night in the Senate and that some of the stakeholder groups within aged care are worried about it. So let's use this opportunity to be clear. The immunity will only apply where restrictive practices are used as a last resort, only to the extent that they are necessary for the shortest time possible and in the least restrictive form, and crucially I think here, to prevent harm to the care recipient. So it is a temporary measure, we take that on board, and it is just to clarify a gap in the legislation between the Commonwealth legislation and some of the state and territory legislative requirements with respect to use of restrictive practices. Specifically, you asked about the revisiting it, specifically until we bring in the new Aged Care Act, which the Royal Commission has asked us to do by 1 July next year. So this is a sunset clause that gets us to the opportunity to consult fully with all of our advocacy groups to make sure that the new Aged Care Act is as good as it could possibly be. This is reform that has to last for decades. We want to do it once, we want to do it well. I'd also note that there are stakeholder groups that support the way that we have done this measure, this temporary measure. The Council of the Ageing has come out in support, particularly in favour of how we have used the particular wording of the measure we've used, and also the Older Persons Advocacy Network. And I want to note that they support the specific amendment because, as without it, harm to older Australians and harm to aged care workers could occur. So that's why we've done it for the next 12 months. And with my time remaining, Mr Speaker, may I update the member for Goldstein that of the 20 residential aged care facilities in her electorate, 4 currently have outbreaks, but above the national average, you have 79.3% with their 4th dose, and more than 99% of aged care workers working in facilities in Goldstein have their 4th dose. So congratulations and thanks for your advocacy on that.
Give the call to the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tackling the rising costs of living in Australia requires a comprehensive response. How is the government helping Australians manage the cost of living crisis it inherited?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much to the member for Bennelong for that important question. We do know that people are doing it tough out there and they're under cost of living pressure. We know that the costs of ordinary supermarket goods and other costs of living expenses are going up, but for a decade we had wages that weren't going up and weren't keeping up with the cost of living. That's why the government has an economic plan to deal with the cost of living pressures and to lift the speed limit on our economy. The first of those is helping Australians with the cost of living through measures like our plans to cut childcare costs, our plans to cut the cost of medicines by up to $12.50 a script, our plan to make work more secure by giving Australians greater financial certainty from one week to the next. That will be a focus of our Jobs and Skills Summit. The second part of the plan is growing wages over time. We successfully argued for a decent pay rise for the lowest paid, some 2.8 million workers. Remember some arguing that the sky would fall in if people on the minimum wage of $20.33 an hour got a $1 increase per hour in their wage. The Fair Work Commission made the assessment that a 5.2% increase should be granted, and we welcome that. We indeed welcome that absolutely, because that is important for people to not fall behind. We also want to train people for higher wage opportunities and to grow the economy, in particular the new economy, through our National Reconstruction Fund to invest in industries delivering more secure, well-paid jobs. But the third element of our plan is also untangling our supply chains and dealing with the supply side of the inflation challenge by investing in cheaper, cleaner, more reliable energy. I know those opposites still don't get that fact, that renewables are the cheapest form of energy, but also addressing skills and labour shortages through 465,000 fee-free TAFE places, an additional 20,000 university places, 10,000 apprenticeships in new energy jobs, but also our establishing the National Reconstruction Fund, our Buy Australia plan, our dealing with infrastructure projects that actually boost productivity rather than looking at the electoral map. Together, these three measures, helping with the cost of living, growing wages over time, untangling our supply chain issues, will all lead to higher economic growth, more security and higher living standards for Australians. That's our economic plan, and we intend to pursue it in partnership with business and unions and civil society at the Jobs and Skills Summit next month.
Order. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today we have 2 members of the Legislative Assembly of the Northern Territory, the Honourable Selina Yubo, Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, and the Honourable Lauren Moss, Minister for Environment, Climate Change and Water Security. I extend a warm welcome to you both. And I give the call to the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of reports of Cfmeu picketers verbally abusing and mobbing a female employee at an Adelaide building site, to the extent that she was unable to leave the site for fear of her personal safety? The Cfmeu has given over $10 million to the Labor Party since the last watchdog was abolished. So why is this Prime Minister prioritising the interests of the Cfmeu over the safety of women.
I give the call. Order. Order. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Lindsay for her question, and I make this very clear point, that all workplaces should be safe workplaces. I'm not aware of the specific example that the member raises, but it certainly sounds on the face of it of being completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. And the fact is that unacceptable behaviour in all workplaces, including Parliament House, should be acted upon by appropriate authorities. If someone is being involved, well,
the Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting.
The truth is
the Deputy Leader will cease interjecting.
Those opposite know that, in fact, the ABCC does not have the power or the jurisdiction to act on crimes. That is not the role of the ABCC. Those opposite know that that's the case, but they continue to pretend that there's some connection between those two elements. There is not. All workplaces should be safe. That's principle number one. No, they're not. And this workplace hasn't always been safe either. All workplaces should be.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I wouldn't have thought this was a controversial statement, Mr. Speaker. To actually stand at this dispatch box, I was asked a serious question and I'm giving a serious answer, which is that all workplaces should be safe, whether they be white-collar, whether they be blue-collar, whether they be in construction, whether they be FIFO workers, whether they be at an accountancy firm, whether they be at a legal firm. All workplaces should be safe workplaces, and we should work towards that, which is why we will implement all 50 recommendations of the Jenkins report when it comes to making workplaces safe. And I look forward to the opposition voting for that legislation when it comes before the parliament.
I give the call to the member for Bean.
Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. What are the implications of the Reserve Bank's decision on interest rates today?
I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's another difficult day for Australian homeowners with a mortgage. The Independent Reserve Bank has just announced its decision to increase interest rates by another 0.5%, bringing the cash rate to 1.85%. Now, Australians knew that this was coming, but it won't make it any easier for them to handle. This cycle of interest rate rises began before the election in response to inflationary pressures that began accelerating at the beginning of this year. Now, average homeowners with a $330,000 outstanding balance will have to find about $90 a month more for repayments as a consequence of this decision today, on top of around $220 extra in repayments since early May. For Australians with a $500,000 mortgage, it's about an extra $140 a month, in addition to the extra $335 they've had to find since early May. Now, as I said, Mr. Speaker, this decision doesn't come as a surprise. It's not a shock to anybody, but it will still sting. Families will now have to make more hard decisions about how to balance the household budget in the face of other pressures like higher grocery prices and higher power prices and the costs of other essentials. Now, obviously, higher interest rates primarily affect mortgage holders, but there's a broader economic impact as well. There's an impact on economic growth, which I talked about in the ministerial statement last week. And there's also an impact on the budget. It means that the $1 trillion of debt that the previous government left us gets even more expensive for us to service. Now, we've been upfront on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, about the growing challenges in our economy, because that's what Australians expect from us. They know that government changed hands at a time of high and rising inflation, rising interest rates, growing economic storm clouds and $1 trillion of debt. And our job isn't to try and influence the Reserve Bank or to second-guess their decisions. Our job is to focus on what we can responsibly influence as a new government at the national level. And that's why the economic plan that the Prime Minister ran through a moment ago is a direct and deliberate response to these challenges that we have inherited. Responsible cost of living relief, addressing those issues on the supply side of the economy, and beginning to trim the budget of the rorts and the waste which are becoming more and more expensive for the Australian people to fund. Australians know that we are in for a difficult time ahead when it comes to the storm clouds in our economy, but we are confident that we will emerge on the other side of this stronger than before, and that's partly because of the economic plan that we will implement.
Order. I give the call to the member for Nichols.
My question is to the Minister for Water and the Environment. Is the Minister aware that 80% of water under the original Murray-Darling Basin plan has already been returned to the environment? And given the Minister's pledge to recover the extra 450 gigalitres of that plan, will the Minister honour the agreement with the states requiring a neutral or positive socio-economic impact on regional communities to recover that water? If not, how will the Minister take that water from farmers?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Well, I want to thank the member for Nichols for his question and say it's a great opportunity for me to speak a little bit about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and the position of those opposite. What we have is a Murray-Darling Basin Plan that has been in place for almost a decade now. The reason that we introduced the plan was because we saw, as demand for water increased, the pressure on communities along the river system, on towns, on cities, on farmers, on irrigators and on the environment was increasing. In fact, in 2019 we saw the driest year on record in the Murray-Darling Basin system. And the fact that we had the Murray-Darling Basin Plan in place then saved the river system from catastrophe. It was still tough, it was very, very tough, but it saved the river system from catastrophe. That's important. We're talking about 1 million square kilometres, 2.3 million people relying on that river system. Now, the member opposite has asked about the 450 gigalitres of additional environmental water that was a condition for South Australia signing on to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. On this side, we fully support returning that 450 gigalitres of water to the system. I'm curious about whether those opposite support this. I know the honourable member doesn't support it. He's already tweeted saying that he doesn't support it.
Order. The Minister will take a break, and I'll just hear from the Leader of the Nationals.
On relevance,
I'll
Mr.
ask
Speaker.
you to state the point of order.
I will. On relevance, it goes to the heart on relevance of whether the Minister will honour the agreement with states requiring the neutrality and positive socio-economic impact for regional communities with relation to that 450. She has not got to the specifics of whether she will adhere and agree to
resume your
that.
seat. Thank you for the point of order. The Minister is halfway through. Order. Order. The Leader of the Nationals was just asked to resume his seat. I'm calling the Minister. She's halfway through her answer. She's being entirely relevant, and I'll ask her to return back to the question.
So, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was saying that we on this side are clear supporters of the 450 gigalitres of additional environmental water being returned to the river system, and I answered a very good question from the member for Mayo about this the other day. Those opposite, we've got some members, including the Leader of the Nationals, who don't support this. We've got the Shadow Minister for Water saying she doesn't support the 450 gigalitres being returned to the river system. Senator McKenzie says that she doesn't support it. But hang on a minute, the member for Sturt says in August last year that he fully supports it. I support the plan. I stand up for the plan. I say we must work together to ensure we are securing and guaranteeing the future. We've got Senator Ruston in June last year saying she supports the plan. We will not stop trying because we are committed to the delivery of the plan. We've got Senator Birmingham saying we support it. We support it in full and on time. Now, after question time, the members opposite might be interested in knowing I will be tabling the Water for the Environment Special Account report I'll be tabling that report that shows that you were never going to achieve the 450 gigalitres, never meant to, never wanted to, never would have.
Order. Order. The member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. What are the Albanese Labor government's plans to continue listing life-changing medications on the PBS and to make medicines cheaper for millions of Australians?
I give the call to order. The minister will be heard in silence, member for Longman. I give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm delighted to get this question from the member for Macarthur because the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, or the PBS, is one of Labor's proudest legacies. Just like Medicare, it was vigorously opposed for many years by the Liberal Party, but it has become one of the world's best medicine systems, balancing fiscal sustainability, timely access to new medicines and patient affordability. And, Mr Speaker, we are getting on with the job of listing new life-saving and life-changing medicines on the PBS for Australians. Already, our government has approved 6 new listings on the PBS, including a listing yesterday of Spinraza for adults with spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, a rare genetic condition which affects the motor neurons in the spinal cord, causing difficulty with basic functions like breathing and swallowing, or paralysis, or even death. This is the first listed treatment, Mr Speaker, for adults with SMA, and without it, Spinraza would cost patients a whopping $300,000 every year. Now, around 100 patients will pay no more than $42.50 for this life-changing medicine. Mr Speaker, we are all lucky to be living through a turbocharged period of discovery which is constantly producing treatments for conditions which not long ago were thought to be untreatable. And our government is committed to the PBS delivering Australian patients affordable access to these extraordinary new medicines. And, Mr Speaker, we'll make them even more affordable, slashing the maximum price of medicines for millions of general patients by $12.50 a script. Not only will this be great for Australian household budgets, it will be good for their health too, because we know from the ABS that around 1 million Australians every year are deciding not to fill a script that their doctor has said is important for their health because they simply can't afford it. Pharmacists tell me and other members on this side, and probably on the other, about customers asking for their advice about which of their medicines is the most important because they can't afford to buy them all, perhaps choosing a medicine that gives them more instant relief but foregoing one that's actually really important for their longer-term health. Well, this government, Mr Speaker, will help prevent Australians from having to shortchange their own health. General patients who fill 2 scripts a month will save $300 a year under our government, while also getting access to innovative new treatments like Spinraza. Mr Speaker, we are getting on with the job of delivering better health care and cost of living relief to Australian households.
Give a call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the government support the Coalition's policy to help pensioners and veterans who may choose to work more hours to help fill vacancies in sectors like tourism, agriculture, hospitality and home care?
Order. Order. The Prime Minister will order. Members on my right, the Prime Minister will be heard in silence. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. And one of the things that the Jobs and Skills Summit is going to address is bringing unions, employers, bringing civil society together to discuss how we address the acute skills shortages that are impacting on business. One way that we can do it, and I'm pleased I refer the Shadow Minister to my ageing vision statement given at the beginning of 2020 in Brisbane, where I referred to exactly the sort of idea of how we work through constructively ways to encourage older Australians to participate more in the workforce. That's something that I proposed way back in 2020. It's something that is going to be considered along with a whole range of other measures about how we can deal with the acute skill shortages which are there in our economy, which are holding people back, holding businesses back. One of the things that occurred, of course, at the time of the outbreak of the pandemic was that Australia, we told all people on temporary visa holders to go. That's had a real impact now, because what's occurred now in critical areas, including the hospitality sector, is that you have around the country restaurants that can't open 7 days a week, can't even open 5 days a week, because they simply can't get the staff that are available. It's having an impact in agriculture. It's having an impact in the construction and infrastructure sector as well. It's also, of course, feeding into inflation, because if you have a failure to be able to access the labour market, then that can increase your costs. So this government's determined to have comprehensive plans. We're determined to consult with business and unions on these ideas, and I'm pleased, and I recommend there's actually a book of the vision statements altogether, which I recommend to the Shadow Minister. There's lots of ideas there. We put a whole range of those ideas with fully costed policies during the election campaign. We'll be feeding those ideas into the Jobs and Skills Summit. I'm not sure whether the opposition, of course, some have called for the Jobs and Skills Summit to not go ahead. Others have sought an invite. I'm not quite sure what their position is on it. But we'll be consulting with the business community and with unions and with civil society on how we address these great challenges. And I'm pleased that my ministerial colleague, Minister O'Connor, is working hard in the lead-up to the summit on a series of local events as well that will also take those ideas.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I give the call to the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to make early childhood education more accessible and affordable, boosting our economy by unlocking workforce participation for women?
And I give the call to the Minister for Early Education.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hawke for the question. I know that the member for Hawke has a long and ongoing commitment to early childhood education and to women's economic empowerment. And it was actually great to hear the member for Hawke speak yesterday through his maiden speech, or his first speech, so passionately about education and the role of women in his life. Mr Speaker, for too long these important issues, the issues around the early childhood sector and women's economic empowerment and the connection between the two, have been undervalued and underappreciated. This morning, my Labor colleagues and I heard from a delegation of early childhood education workers who are up in the gallery today, and we heard from them the issues that they have and that have impacted on them, that have impacted on the sector, that have impacted on women's workforce participation and, importantly, have impacted on children's well-being. So I'm really pleased to be able to speak about what an Anthony Albanese Labor government is doing in this space. As I've advised the chamber before, right now early childhood education is more expensive than ever before. And, Mr Speaker, I remember as a young single mother how I had to rely on early childhood education and just what that meant for me to be able to raise myself and my family out of poverty. And I can't imagine how much more difficult it is now for somebody in that situation, given how much the cost of early childhood education has increased. And that's why the Albanese Labor government is acting to ensure that early childhood education is more affordable for 1.26 million Australians, with our election commitment to increase the childcare subsidy. We're also asking the ACCC to design a price regulation mechanism for early childhood education aimed at making it more affordable and more accessible across the country. And we're going to be asking the Productivity Commission to review the sector. We know that while making early childhood education more accessible is a noble goal, we also need to be able to support and expand our vital workforce in this space. There is a worryingly high turnover in the sector that leads to issues of quality, and we heard that very clearly from the early childhood educators who we met with earlier today. We're committed to developing, recognising and supporting a high-quality early education workforce, and the Minister for Education, Minister Clare, and myself have got in front of us a fairly rigorous agenda of meeting with the sector through sector roundtables to feed into the Jobs and Skills Summit next month. I want to take this opportunity just to acknowledge the hard work that those who are currently in this sector do and to thank them for everything that they've done.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Wentworth.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Minister, many people in my community are concerned about climate change. Climate scientists are telling us we need a 2030 emissions target reduction of at least 50% to prevent catastrophic climate change. And the Business Council of Australia has said that Australian businesses can thrive under a 46 to 50% reduction by 2030. So my question is, what are the scientific or business reasons for the government's 2030 target of 43%?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and thank her for her engagement in her time so far in this place. I'll make a number of comments about the government's 43% emissions reduction target. As the Prime Minister has made clear repeatedly, we went to the election with that target and sought a mandate from the Australian people for that target and received that mandate. And that's important to the Prime Minister. It's important to this side of the House to maintain and honour the commitments that we made at the election. Secondly, as Professor Mark Howden, the Director of the ANU Centre for Climate and Energy and Disaster Recovery and a Vice Chair of the IPCC, has said, the 43% emissions reduction target is entirely consistent with the obligations set out at the Glasgow conference last year and entirely consistent with Australia's obligations under the Glasgow conference. Another point I would make, Mr Speaker, and this is an important one, is that targets are very important. But even more important than the targets are the policies underpinning it. Right. When we released the 43% emissions reduction target, it was the modelled result of the range of policies we committed to at the same time. Targets are important, but they are easier set than met. It's important to accompany those targets with the policies, whether it is our safeguards reforms, or our rewiring the nation's policy, or our electric vehicle tax cut and electric vehicle strategies, which will give Australians the choice and chance to buy electric vehicles and enjoy the weekend at the same time, whether it's our community batteries policy or our solar banks policy. The range of policies are important, and we're getting on and implementing all of those. And the other thing that's important, Mr Speaker, to get the investment in renewable energy, to get the targets underway, is certainty and policy frameworks being legislated. I thank the member for Wentworth for her public announcement that she will be supporting our legislation in the House, because that is important. It sends the message that not only does Australia now have a government that gets it, we have a parliament that gets it too, and will provide that policy certainty and framework for investors right around the world who see Australia as an opportunity for that investment, because we want Australia to be a renewable energy powerhouse. We want Australia to take advantage of those economic opportunities, because we see the world's climate emergency, and there is one, as Australia's jobs opportunity.
Give the call to the member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. How will the Albanese Labor government's Pacific labour mobility policies tackle skill shortages in regional Australia?
Give the call to the Minister.
Question, and I congratulate the Speaker on your election last week. Labour mobility is central to the government's agenda for engaging with the Pacific, and it's also central to engaging with the government's agenda to tackle the skill shortage in regional Australia. The Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, or PALM, allows workers from the Pacific countries to come to Australia to work in sectors like horticulture, tourism and hospitality. It helps Australian employers facing skills shortages. It supports Australia's regional economies, and it gives Pacific countries a source of remittance income. And vitally, it gives Pacific Islanders the chance to learn new skills. It truly is a win-win for economic development in the Pacific and deepens Australia's engagement with the region. Now, Mr Speaker, PALM grew out of the Pacific Seasonal Worker Program established in 2012 by the former Labor government. And now in 2022, the Albanese Labor government is expanding PALM as part of our Pacific policy to repair the damage done by the last government under their Pacific stuff-up. We will make PALM more attractive for employers and workers by reducing the burden of travel costs for employers, allowing Pacific workers to bring in family members, and critically improving protections against worker exploitation. Mr Speaker, importantly, we'll also broaden the scheme so it tackles skill shortages not only in traditional areas like agriculture, but also in new sectors like aged care that are suffering due to the disgraceful neglect of the previous government. And during the recent very successful Pacific Islands Forum meeting in Fiji, I visited the Australia-Pacific Training Coalition facility in Suva with Prime Minister Albanese. We met around 40 enthusiastic women who were training to work in aged care centres in regional Queensland from Mackay to Toowoomba. They were studying the theory and carrying out the practical training for Certificate 3 qualifications. And, Mr Speaker, they were absolutely thrilled to be coming to Australia to look after aged care residents. And as the Prime Minister said, it was a great day because it highlighted the importance of the PALM scheme. And it demonstrated that the government's commitment to improved aged care is already translating into outcomes in the labour market. The Australia-Pacific Training Coalition told us that the government's election commitments was a key driver of why they'd stepped up training in aged care. And, Mr Speaker, Labor started the Pacific Labour Mobility Program, and now the new Labor government is expanding it. This will deliver economic benefits for regional Australia, and it will support economic and social development in the Pacific, repairing a damaged relationship that occurred under the last government, where you had a PM who blocked action on climate change, you had an opposition leader who made jokes about rising climate.
The minister will resume his seat. The manager on the opposition business. Opposition business.
Well, Mr Speaker, even on the ruling that you've given, there was nothing in this question inviting the minister to comment on what happened under the previous government. So you should draw him back to the terms of the question.
I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. He's probably got a point on this one.
My job is done. I call the minister. To be relevant, order. Order. I will uphold the manager of opposition business point of order for 15 seconds. Be relevant.
I tried to get away with it, Mr Speaker, but the truth is that the PALM is vital to helping address the skill shortages in regional Australia, to repair the disgraceful impact of the neglect on those opposite in the aged care sector.
I give the call to the member for Deakin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. The cashless debit card presently restricts 80% of working-age welfare payments in vulnerable communities from being spent on alcohol, drugs and gambling. Will you, Prime Minister, guarantee there'll be no increase in the number of drunken violent acts suffered by women and children when you cancel the card as you've promised?
Order. Members on my right. I give the call to the Minister for Social Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, because there has been a lot of rhetoric heard in the debate by the Shadow Minister, but also in the debate last night, but not a lot of evidence. And the evidence is very clear. It was laid out. It was laid out in the ANAO report, and I remind the House that the government did not demonstrate.
The minister will just resume her seat for a moment. Order. Questions have been heard in silence. Answers will be heard in silence. This is question time and it is answer time as well. I call the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you. And I remind the House that the government was not able to demonstrate that the CDC program was meeting its intended objectives. That is from the ANAO report. But I continued reading the ANAO report and I found some other interesting information in Table 1.2, and that is in 2020, the then former government reduced in the objectives of the Act to actually reference violence and harm and the reduction in trial sites. That was point B, and it removed that actually from the objectives. So in the new objectives, there was no reference to trying to determine whether violence or harm was reducing.
Order. The minister will just pause. The member for Deakin.
Point of order, Mr Speaker, on relevance. The question was, will the Prime Minister or the minister in his stead promise that there won't be more violence inflicted on women and children as a result of putting more alcohol and...
The member will resume his seat. The minister is being completely relevant and referring to the program and the ANO report regarding the outcomes. And I give the call to the minister, who will be heard in silence.
So in 2015, the former government was then interested in whether or not the cashless debit card reduced violence or harm in the trial areas, but by 2020 they were no longer interested. And why? Why, you might wonder? Well, that is because they could not provide any evidence to suggest there was a reduction of harm and violence in communities. And we've heard a lot from those on the other side about the University of Adelaide report. The University of Adelaide report, and I want to go to the part of the report that talked about safety, crime and family violence, where it said that 60% of CDC participants reported that they did not feel safer since the introduction of the CDC card, and 28%, that's more than 1 in 4 participants reported their safety had reduced since the introduction of the CDC card. So if we go to the evidence, and ignore the ideological rhetoric from those over, we see that this program did not make a difference when it came to safety and harm. Indeed, what it did for participants is make discrimination normalised in communities, stigma normalised in communities, and of course it had practical problems that meant that people couldn't buy a second-hand fridge because they didn't have enough cash. It meant that families couldn't take their children to the football because they didn't have enough cash. This has had real problems in communities and we are acting to fix it.
Order. I give the call to the member for Bruce. Order. The member for Bruce will be heard in silence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Financial Services. What steps is the government taking to ensure that Indigenous families and communities affected by the collapse of UPLA are being assisted as quickly as possible to be able to move forward with their lives?
I give the call to the Assistant Treasurer.
I thank the member for Bruce for his question, and can I congratulate you on your elevation, Mr Speaker, to the Speaker's chair. I want to start by acknowledging that in the Speaker's gallery today are representatives of the Save Sorry Business Coalition. They've travelled from the Kimberley, they've travelled from Moree, they've travelled from Ballarat, they've travelled from New England and from other places around the country so that their voices can be heard by members of this place. They have a sorry story to tell. The collapse of the UPLA group has affected thousands of First Nations families around Australia who are relying on this funeral benefit insurance to allow them to mourn their loved ones and to conduct sorry business. The government, the Albanese Labor government, recognises the sorrow and grief and anguish that the collapse of this business has caused to these communities. I want to thank the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. I want to thank the First Nations members of the Labor caucus and other members of this House who've made representations to myself and the Minister for Indigenous Affairs on this matter. The government recognises the significant distress. Investigations are underway into the behaviour of the directors and the company, but our first and our immediate priority is to ensure that bodies which are today sitting in morgues because families cannot afford to bury them and conduct the important cultural business of sorry business is allowed to go ahead. As a short-term measure, the program that the government has put in place will ensure that claims received from between the 1st of April of last year
And the 30th of November next year, we'll be honoured. We will stand in the shoes of the insurer. We estimate that this will benefit up to 500 First Nations families around Australia who would otherwise be left without a funeral benefit. More work needs to be done to ensure that we can resolve all the other issues associated with this collapse. But we must ask ourselves, if there was a voice to Parliament prior to 2020, would it have told us that we need to change the law to ensure that these dodgy insurance products are not sold to vulnerable communities? If there was a voice to Parliament in 2020,
shall be heard in silence.
Would it have told us that the collapse of this program was going to cause the sort of harm that we've described to these communities and these families? The answer is yes.
I give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's answer yesterday where he couldn't say how much the cash rate had increased since those opposite came to government.
Order.
Mr Speaker, given the Reserve Bank's decision today, how much higher is the cash rate compared to when those opposite came to government? What is the impact on the average mortgage payment?
Give the call. Order. Order. Members on my left and right. The Minister for Resources is not helping. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
The cash rate went up by 0.5 today, as it went up by 0.5 last month, and it went up by 0.5 the month before.
And order. I give the call to the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure. As the government considers its approach to grants programs, what lessons can be learned from the recent Australian National Audit Office into the Building Better Regions Fund?
I give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And as we as a parliament contemplate the legacy of $1 trillion of debt that has been left to us by those opposite, and we contemplate how we manage that as an economy, it is very enlightening to have a bit of an insight into the way in which the previous government decided to spend taxpayers' money. And the Australian National Audit Office tabled a report last Thursday, an audit report that is scathing of the way in which this government previously spent taxpayer money. This is a decade of rorts that we saw from the previous government. And let's just have a look. Let's just have a look at what the Australian National Audit Office had to say. And what it actually had to say, members particularly of the Liberal Party, I would point out, that it wasn't just Labor seats that missed out because of the way in which largely the National Party were benefited. It actually was Liberal Party seats. Many of the seats, the regional seats held by the Liberal Party members opposite, missed out on meritorious projects because of the way the National Party administered this program. And what we actually saw from that audit report is over 65% of the projects of the infrastructure stream, which made up almost all of the billion-dollar program, were not the ones that were deemed by the department as the most meritorious. And in fact, in round 5, some media reports will tell you that it is in fact you were more likely to get funded if you had a low score than if you actually had a high score.
Her seat. Order. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy. I will hear from the member for Wannon.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Resume your seat. There is no point of order. You do not start a point of order like that. The Minister is in order and I give her the call. I warn the House, points of order during questions will not be tolerated if they are to be disruptive. And I give the call to the Minister.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And they're a little sensitive over on that side of the House about the way in which they administered this program. As I said, 65% of projects. Mr. Speaker, could I ask that you ask the Leader of the Opposition to withdraw that comment, please?
If the minister heard an unparliamentary term, I'd ask the Leader of the Opposition to withdraw.
I made no such unparliamentary remark, Mr. Speaker.
I'll call the minister.
Thank you very much. And what the audit found was, in fact, that it is more likely if you had a low score,
the Leader of the Opposition,
that your project would actually be funded than a high score. That is the legacy of this government, the previous government, when it comes to these programs. And not only did the Audit Office actually find that there was a lack of transparency, what they increasingly did is that they ignored the Commonwealth Grants guidelines and then changed the way in which they operated. And by the fifth round of this program, what we actually saw is that the previous government actually requested that the department didn't give them any recommendations, so that they didn't have to report when they counteracted the Department of Infrastructure. That's what we saw. There isn't a National Party member who wouldn't like to get their hands on $1 for their seats at the expense of many.
Order. I give the call to the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education and Youth. With around 7,000 vacancies in early childhood education sector, I ask the Minister how many more workers will be needed under Labor's universal childcare policy.
I give the call to the Minister for Order. Order. The question was heard. Order. The question was heard in silence. The minister on my left, the Leader of the Nationals, is on a warning. I give the call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question. And may I also take this opportunity to congratulate the member for Moncrieff on being appointed as the opposition shadow spokesperson on this issue as well, and to thank her for her interest in early childhood education. We know that more needs to be done to develop and recognise the workforce. We recognise that there are serious workforce issues, and as I mentioned in my last response, we met earlier today, or I met and my Labor colleagues met earlier today with members from the early childhood education sector, and primarily a lot of the issues that they were raising were around workforce issues. We recognise that there is a shortage in the workforce, and the workforce needed now to fill in the vacancies for early childhood education. Not just in the workforce itself, but it may interest the member to know also that the retention rates for early childhood educators in Certificates 3 and in Diploma are also very low and have reduced quite significantly actually over the last 2 years, but even before COVID those retention rates were very low. To go to the member's question before the Deputy Leader stands up to interject, to go to the member's question about workforce requirements, the figures that were published earlier this week, that quote, I think it was around 6,500 vacancies, are correct, and we do anticipate that those vacancies will increase, not just as a result of a Labor government making it more affordable and more accessible for children to access early childhood education.
Order. Order. The Minister is answering the question. I'll ask her to pause for a moment. The member for Moncrieff.
It's on a point of order on relevance, Mr. Speaker, because the Minister's not outlined...
Resume your seat. Resume your seat, the member for Moncrieff. The Minister... resume your seat. The Minister is being entirely irrelevant. You asked about the workforce needed in early childhood. She is referring exactly to that point. I give the call to the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So, in response to what we're doing about the workforce issues that have persisted for many years, including for the last 9 years in which this previous government resided over these issues in the workforce, there are a number of things that we're doing. As I mentioned in my previous answer, the Minister for Education and myself are conducting a rigorous agenda of consulting with the sector. We have been consulting with the sector and continue to consult with the sector in the lead up to the Jobs and Skills Summit, but there are a number of other Labor government policies that are going to help that issue as well. We've got the fee-free TAFE policy, we've got free education, university places that we know will help to resolve some of those issues in the workforce sector. I'm not underestimating the challenge ahead of us in this, and I will assure the member for Moncrieff that we have not underestimated the challenge ahead of us in addressing these workforce issues. I will say that they are not just in the early childhood education sector, but across the care sector generally, and I can also assure those opposite that it is only a Labor government that's going to do something about it.
Order. The member's time has expired. Minister's time has expired. Order. I give the call to the member for Reid.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. How will the government continue to support displaced Ukrainian nationals and their immediate family members until Ukraine is victorious against the brutal invasion?
I give the call to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and congratulate her on her election to this place and her magnificent first speech last week. I take this opportunity also to congratulate you on your elevation, Mr Speaker. The illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Mr Putin has seen cities devastated, reduced to rubble, immense loss of life and untold damage to the people of Ukraine. And I want to be very clear that the Australian government's support for Ukrainian sovereignty is unwavering, as most particularly shown by the visit of our Prime Minister to Kyiv. Also, the Australian government stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and we will support them as long as it takes for Ukraine to emerge victorious from this brutal invasion. I'm sure that is a sentiment shared by everyone in this place. And this government is committed to ensuring that Ukrainians, both in and outside of Australia, can not only find safety in the Australian community, but can also access appropriate visas to enable them and also their families to thrive in Australia. And I note that since the 23rd of February of this year, the Australian government has granted more than 8,600 visas to Ukrainians in Ukraine and hundreds more to Ukrainians elsewhere. Now, in late June, Mr Speaker, I was advised that the temporary humanitarian offer for Ukrainian nationals had a deadline imposed by the former government of 30 June. This was done so without updating the website nor informing the Ukrainian Australian community. However, this government understands how important communicating important information like this is to the community. And accordingly, I extended the offer to allow those unaware of this hidden deadline to take advantage of the important temporary humanitarian stay offer. I also extended the offer to the immediate family members of Ukrainian nationals who did not hold Ukrainian citizenship, so that families fleeing this invasion were not unnecessarily split. I'm sure, again, that is a decision welcomed by all members of this place. However, the offer, and the Shadow Minister may pay attention at this point, the offer which was established by members opposite bars recipients from being able to leave this country whilst holding that visa and from ever being able to apply for a permanent protection visa. These were crucial facts, like the deadline imposed on the program, that were not communicated to the Australian-Ukrainian community, leaving Ukrainian nationals in the dark. This oversight has been of great concern to me and the government and to the community, which is why I have been negotiating with the community to ensure that these oversights, which I'm sure were not attended, have been intended to, and so that community members can be given the support that they deserve and which I think every member of this place agrees they are entitled to while this invasion, this brutal invasion, continues, and they deserve our help.
Call the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for Immigration for that answer and say to the Ukrainian Australian community that this entire parliament stands with you at this difficult time, given the ongoing brutality of the Russian invasion. And on that basis, I also ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Just briefly on indulgence, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I join with the Prime Minister and the Minister in pledging our support to provide every effort to help a country through its darkest hour. When we were in government, we provided over $280 million worth of defence equipment and aid to the Ukrainian government to try and save the lives of men, women and children and to push back on the oppressors. This illegal invasion of the Ukraine has gone on for way too long, and sadly there's no end in sight, and we hope that there is peace that can prevail at some point, and the fact that we've been able to extend on a bipartisan basis support to the Ukrainian people and to provide a new home, a new start for them and their families in significant number is something that our nation should be very proud of.